We initiated these events, these collection evenings, back in 2017 as a way to show the work that is being done with the Society's collections, how they're being used to develop new research, and what is being done to catalogue and conserve them. In particular, the collections evenings are conceived as an important opportunity to highlight the work that has been done by the Society's large number of volunteers who have worked with archives, manuscripts, artworks, and rare books to make them more discoverable and accessible, better understood, and better preserved for the years ahead. Before I go any further, I should probably mention something that I'm sure many of you are curious to know about, that the Society is planning to gradually return to our usual opening hours, including reading room opening hours, after Easter, once government restrictions have been lifted, and we will announce our plans for this through the Society's website and on social media. And of course, if you have any particular questions, you're free to get in touch. It's been just over a year since the pandemic hit the UK, and the Society's activities have been seriously disrupted throughout that period. But we have continued to do what we can to make the collections accessible to users, both so that they can be used in ongoing academic research, which does continue despite everything, and so that they can continue to provide inspiration and enjoyment. While much has been delayed and interrupted over the last 12 months, this evening's event is a wonderful opportunity to show some of the things that we have been able to do despite the challenges with which we're all too familiar. And I'm very grateful to each of tonight's presenters for agreeing to introduce these projects to us. First, Jung Min will describe her work with the transactions of the Korea branch of the RAS, explaining the importance of this resource, not only for understanding the work of this extraordinary cultural institution in itself, but also for assessing its significance in the context of Korean studies more broadly. Next, Lily Colgan will talk to us about the fascinating and quite remarkable archival and art collections of the West brothers, 5 railway engineers working in northwest India in the late 19th century, who became interested in numerous aspects of Indian culture and who prepared meticulous documentation of the artistic wonders of the Kanheri Caves system near Mumbai. Finally, the Society's new archivist, Emma Jones, is going to describe the projects she has been working on since taking over from Nancy Charlie back in October. We will have brief opportunities for questions after each presentation, and we would ask that you use Zoom's chat function to submit these. Before we start, I also want to share some other updates about work with the Society's collections, as the projects you will hear about are far from the only ongoing volunteer activities at the Society. Ian Herbertson has been auditing the cataloguing status of the Society's artworks, checking the descriptions of our online Kohar catalogue against Raymond Head's catalogue published in 1991, assessing the consistency of descriptions, possible omissions, and establishing where items acquired after 1991 are or are not listed online. About half the art collection had been reviewed when the pandemic started, and the exercise will be finished once restrictions are lifted. One small byproduct of the project was identifying an unknown, quote-unquote, sheet of drawings of coins as being attributable to James Todd. Emmanuel Ventura has almost finished cataloguing a collection of papers belonging to RAS stalwart Dennis Duncanson, including some interesting material on politics in post-war Malaysia. This includes some of Duncanson's own typed manuscripts, and this cataloguing will also be completed once volunteer access to the physical collections is permitted. I'm also delighted to report that a research article has just gone live online on First View, which is an online portal where you can see articles from the Society's journal before they are published in the print edition. The article in question is by Mathilde Renaud and Ulrich Marzolf and is titled An Illustrated Shi'ai Pilgrimage Scroll in the Collections of the Royal Asiatic Society. The article grew from a project that Mathilde completed for the Society as part of her Conservation MA at Camberwell College of Arts. And Mathilde's efforts to understand and conserve the scroll led to a research collaboration with Professor Marzolf, which in turn has given rise to this article. Mathilde, in fact, presented the outcomes of her conservation project at the Society's Collections Evening 2 years ago. So we're thrilled this has now led to an article in the journal as well. Truly a multifaceted project. Further details will be provided in a post on the Society's blog, which is coming out tomorrow. This will include an overview of the conservation project written by Mathilde herself. So we're extremely grateful to her for everything that she has contributed to the Society over the past few years. So without further ado, I would like to introduce this evening's first speaker, Jung Min, who joined us in October as a research assistant after completing her master's degree in Korean studies at SOAS as a recipient of the Korean government long-term fellowship for overseas study.
Good evening. It's Jung Min from South Korea. I got a master's degree in Korean studies from SOAS last year. I'm interested in learning more about Korean history, particularly in the early 20th century. I've been working as a volunteer at the Royal Asiatic Society since last October. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the tasks I've been working on at the Society, which has involved research around the Korea branches of Royal Asiatic Society and some interesting facts about the branch. I made a master file of the Korea branch's activities, including lectures, excursions to cultural heritage sites, and articles in transactions. Whilst compiling this, I got to learn about the Korea branch's history and its significance towards the origin of Korean studies. The Korea branch has published its journal Transactions since 1900, when it was established. Until 2019, it was published around 400 papers in Transactions and held 1,250 lectures and 2,500 tours and events. I made this file of all activities divided into 3 themes, and I compared it with the original text and revised it if necessary. This task was possible thanks to the journal being digitized. Without this, I would have needed to check titles, authors, lecturers, and dates and so on in the original text one by one, which would have taken more than 1 year. We can read Transactions on the Korea branch's homepage and the India University library page, which carried out the Transactions digitization project. This is easily accessible due to it being in ebook, PDF, and Word file format. The project was implemented in 2011 with support from the Academy of Korean Studies. This support means the value and the significance of Transactions are now acknowledged. Furthermore, in 2019, researchers in Korean studies published 2 voluminous books which critically reviewed and closely analyzed the Transactions. Around 100 years ago, Westerners in Korea wanted to know about where they live, so they watched, read, listened, traveled, studied, and recorded the result of their research through papers in the transactions. And now, researchers read and review the work of these Westerners and their point of views, critically analyzing how they contributed to the understanding of Korean culture in the West and Korea itself. As such, the early transactions, which began to publish it 120 years ago as a way to understand Korea, has become an object of interest to researchers in their own right. If so, what's the significance of transactions? From the beginning, the Korea branch emphasized its feature as a learned society. We can see the society's goal in its constitution, Article 1, which was adopted at the first meeting on the 16th of June, 1900. Transactions was the first serious attempt to investigate Korea from an objective, critical, and balanced viewpoint. This covered a wide range of topics: art, astronomy, history, literature, arboretum, ornithology, commerce, climate, customs, folklore, medicine, music, transportation, government, myth, religions such as Buddhism, Confucianism, Shamanism, Taoism, and Christianity. These were primary sources for Western scholars to learn facts on Korea, especially the early stage of Korean studies. Now, these have become key texts for Korean scholars to review and re-estimate Westerners' perspectives on early modern Korea. Then, what was the beginning of the group who left this academic access like? On the 16th of June 1900, the Korea branch was established. The constitution and bylaws were adopted and staff officers were elected on that day. Before the inauguration, they communicated with the RAS London and asked for affiliation. Although letters on the association are not found, the RAS Council minutes state that the RAS gladly admitted it as a branch. 17 members gathered at the first meeting. As we can see, the majority of the members were American missionaries. At this point, I was wondering why they wanted to become a RAS branch. It is supposed that the Korean government didn't treat the Occidental group with hospitality at that time. In the late 19th century, the government hesitated to open the door to the powers. Meanwhile, some progressive young Koreans formed a group for the Enlightenment movement. Their activities seemed quite radical, so the government began to regard this as an anti-regime movement. And they were suspicious that some Westerners were involved in this radical group's activities. In that circumstance, Westerners in Korea might have needed special protection under the name of the Royal Asiatic Society, and then they could enjoy some academic freedom. Although the society was organized in 1900, there were 3 phases. The first half of the 20th century was a turbulent period in Korean history, and the Korea branch was affected by historical events. Shortly after launching the society, it had to come to a halt due to the Russo-Japanese War in 1903, the annexation of Korea and Japan in 1910, and other historical events. They resumed their activities in 1911. Since then, many papers were produced and many topics were dealt with. This period might be called the first golden age. But after the outbreak of the Pacific War, the surveillance by Japanese authorities intensified, and they decided to cease their activities such as publication and gathering. For instance, the threat was so real that Dr. Kunz, one of the society's officers, was arrested and interned right after finishing the proofreading of a paper on the 8th of December 1941. After liberation, the Korea branch resumed, but it was long before it stopped again. The Korean War left deep scars on Korean people and the society as well. Its library was absolutely destroyed, and Charles Hunt, who had remained in Seoul, was captured by communists and never returned. It was not until the 1960s that the society could operate more normally and Korean studies developed rapidly. Actually, while reviewing the title of papers and lectures, I was a bit dissatisfied because it is hard to find articles on contemporary politics or international relations. As members were more from Western countries, neither Korea nor Japan, I thought they would be able to express their opinions more freely. However, it turned out to be a misunderstanding. Western people in Korea were also profoundly influenced by historical and political conditions. Lastly, I introduce some early members and their achievements in Korea. These 5 were attendees of the first meeting in 1900. John Governs, the British diplomat, became the first president of RAS Korea. The rest of them were all American missionaries. Homer Herbert was interested in history and language. He translated and wrote books on Korea in both English and Korean. One of his great impacts on Korean society is introducing word spacing and full stops in Korean, I think. Also, he carried out clandestine missions for Korean independence under the King's order, and due to this, he was forced to leave Korea by Japanese authorities. After liberation, he was awarded a Medal of the National Foundation by the Korean government. Henry Appenzeller and Horace Underwood founded secondary school and college in the late 19th century and contributed to modern education in Korea. Horace Allen was a missionary and doctor. He established the first modern hospital in Korea by the King's order and became the King's physician. As we can see, the individual members also contributed to Korean society, and their lives were affected by the socio-political environment in Korea. This has been a great opportunity for me to learn about the Royal Asiatic Society Korea branch as the origin of Korean studies and some legacy of its members. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jung, for that wonderful presentation. It's a very rare privilege to be introduced to the history of RAS Korea, which is an extraordinarily resilient institution and one that's played a key role, as you've laid out, in the history of Korean studies. I have a question for you, which is it true or fair to say that the transactions of RAS Korea would be the longest running English language publication on Korean studies, published as continuously as possible, considering the political and military situation in Korea in the first half of the century?
Actually, before the RAS Korea, there was a Western groups, and they published 2 magazines, 2 journals. One of the title of the one of the title of the journal was Korean Respiratory, or maybe anyway, but it was very short time, and the transaction and the establishment of the RAS Korea became the almost first institution for the Korean studies and the first trial. I think.
It's I think the sociological composition of the society is very interesting, and I suspect similar to the composition of RAS branches in elsewhere in East Asia.
And I'd like to say something. As I mentioned before, from the 1960s, the Korean studies developed rapidly, and the RAS Korea branch is not the only one institution for the Korean studies anymore. And there are more academic and professional institutions in university or the centers. So the role or the position of RAS Korea would not be same to the past. So, but nevertheless, the Korea branch can still play some roles. I think it has associated many researchers, and this network is its asset. So. They can cover various topics and various level of audience. So these wide spectrums are the traits of the RAS Korea, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I haven't got any questions coming in from the chat at the moment, but we can keep it open for later in the event if there are other questions pertaining to RAS Korea and Jung's presentation. Then we can, with your permission, Jung, we can come back to you as those come in. So. Okay, well, Jung, thank you again, and we'll move on to the next presentation, which is from Lily Colgan, who completed her MA in History of Art and Archaeology at SOAS, focusing on the archival lives of built heritage. Lily has been volunteering at the Society since October 2019, and this evening she'll be talking about her experiences cataloguing the West collection.
Thank you. I should share my screen. Okay. All right. Right, so good evening, and thank you, Ed, for the introduction. And I'd like to say a big thank you to the Royal Asiatic Society for inviting me to talk about this collection and share my experience volunteering. I started volunteering, as Ed said, in October 2019, just after completing my Master's in History of Art and Archaeology from SOAS. And today I will be talking about the West Brothers collection of personal papers. And this is a meticulously organized and incredibly rich collection of topographical drawings, maps, floor plans, elevations, copies of wall paintings, reliefs and sculptures. There are field notes, memos, drafts of papers, correspondence, rubbings, as well as also some biographical and retrospective accounts of how the work came about and about the brothers' time in India, and more specifically the Maharashtra region. So all of the West brothers, Arthur Anderson, Clement, Edward William, Henry and Walter, were born in Pentonville, London in the mid-1800s. And their initial connection, for want of a better word, to India and to Mumbai specifically was through their father, who was the owner of several cotton processing companies in the city. And more information pertaining to this can be found at the British Library and at the London Metropolitan Archives, which include lots of correspondence and patents. The period of time covered in this collection runs from 1847 to 1906, and this can broadly be split into two parts. The first period, and that's the period of most concentrated work, runs between 1847 and 1870. And this includes material created by 4 of the brothers, that's Arthur, Edward, Clement, and Henry. And then with a small gap in between, the latter part of the collection runs from about 1875 to 1906. And this is when the brothers were based back in England and includes 2 return visits to India, one by Edward and one by Walter, with the specific intention of completing the documentation of specific sites. So the collection is comprised of 7 bound leather folders, each containing on average 3 to 4 smaller folders. And the collection has previously been undocumented, and I believe it was certain parts that were listed as works of art. However, there is far much more to the collection than this. And so the main objective of this project was to clean and document the material for accessibility purposes. And so the main focus of this collection is given over to the Kanheri Caves, and this is contained in portfolios 1 to 3 and portfolio 7. The Kanheri Caves are a group of over 109 rock-cut temples located in what is today the Sanjay Gandhi National Park on the western outskirts of Mumbai. And the brothers studied these caves over the course of several decades, returning to the site several times in order to check and amend measurements, locations, and expand upon their interpretation of the site. And this is a bit of a personal theory of mine, but I believe that it's the size of the site that made it of particular interest, especially as other larger sites in the region, such as Ajanta and Ellora, which are also covered in this collection, had already been the subject of quite a bit of research and documentation at the time the brothers found themselves in the region. And then the remainder of the collection covers dozens of different sites. So Ajanta, Ellora, and Aurangabad are documented in portfolio 6, and these are maybe some of the more notable or recognizable sites. And then the collection, I think, is also an excellent resource for those wishing to research smaller sites, many of which are classified as single temple sites or sundries in the Maharashtra region. So portfolio 4 is concerned with the Kondati and Magathin caves. Portfolio 5 is concerned with the Mahar and Kura and Junar caves, as well as others in the Satara district, such as the Rajpuri, Kundal, and Lohari caves. And when I began this project, discussions were had about archival order, and Nancy Charlie, the Society's archivist at the time, and I decided that we would keep the material in its original order. And this is because the order itself was part of the collection's story, and therefore we felt it was important to preserve. Within the collection, there are 3 letters dated between February and March 1906, which were sent from Arthur Anderson West to James Burgess. And they ultimately provide the start of the narrative of how the papers came to the RAS. Burgess is a prominent figure in British archaeology in India in the 19th century. He founded the journal The Indian Antiquary. He was a secretary of the Bombay Geographical Society, and following 2 posts as regional head in both the Western and Southern districts, he became the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1886, and he held this post for 3 years. Burgess published many works on Indian temples, temple architecture and art, including the Cave Temples of India, which was authored by himself and James Ferguson, which to this day is considered a seminal publication on Indian temple architecture. And the letters in this collection were all sent from Arthur, and therefore they give somewhat of a one-sided view into this correspondence. But what I've been able to deduct from this is that they were added to the collection by Burgess. And I think there was some other miscellaneous material which still stylistically kind of don't fit in with the rest of it. It's unclear who approached who, but I believe Burgess approached West, as the earliest letter from West is a response. It's also unclear whether or not Burgess wanted these materials for publication or just for his own personal use. However, Arthur appears to be pushing for the possibility that the material on the Kanheri Caves be published as a book, and he notes the value of this material in these letters. Regardless, nothing appears to have come of this, and the collection remained in Burgess's possession until 1916, when it was gifted to the Society by his wife following his death. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, it was the brother's father was the owner of several cotton processing companies in India. And it was in 1844 that Edward moved to Mumbai as superintendent of machinery and buildings of one of these cotton processing companies. However, I believe that it was the brothers' employment as railway engineers that facilitated this collection. 4 of the brothers, Arthur, Clement, Edward, and Henry, were all engineers with the Great Indian Peninsula Railway. In 1847, 3 years after Edward came to India, Arthur Anderson moved to Mumbai, and in 1849 he went to Gujarat, where he worked on railway surveys and eventually joined the Great Indian Peninsula Railway engineering staff in 1853. It was 2 years before this, in 1851, Edward joined the engineering staff, and he had just moved back to India from England then, and he brought with him his younger brother, who in 1853 is documented to have been conducting preliminary surveys of the Vadodara Railway, and later in 1857 he was appointed executive engineer in Surat, where he died in 1858. That same year, Clement moved to India and too became an employee of the railway company. And I think that this didn't only provide them with the technical training and skills to draw and survey, but also, and arguably more importantly, gave them proximity to the sites that were documented in this collection. And the collection follows the movements that they made with their work, where they were stationed and where they were surveying. And I think this is something that I found particularly interesting to think about whilst working on this collection. And this is, of course, framed by my own approach and understanding of colonial archaeology in India, which I researched for my master's dissertation. But I believe it can be viewed as an extension of the vast surveying projects which literally mapped out Britain's territory on the subcontinent. And the railway itself was also a massive project of colonial infrastructure. Another aspect that I've found particularly interesting whilst going through this material is the small references to how they came across these sites, especially in the earlier years. Arthur wrote about how in the first 5 years or so, the brothers were engaged in what many, and I quote, residents did, leisure time and long walking expeditions during holidays and festival periods. And following this, there is a clear progression that's seen in the materials and the annotated notes that go alongside with it, that there is a progression from what's considered to be like a leisurely pastime to a very methodological documentation project which they took upon themselves. And here I just wanted to show the connection between their work as railway engineers and the formation of the collection. And I think it's quite nicely illustrated in this map. So this is a map of the Gap Incline of the southeastern line of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway. And this was made by Arthur Anderson West in 1866. And this map has been annotated in red ink by Arthur, and he maps out historical and religious sites, which I think is set quite nicely against the black ink of the topography, railway lines and stations. And there are also notes for like possible future research and places to explore. And here I just wanted to show in a bit more detail, as you can see his notes. And then here, I just wanted to use this image, which is a sketch of a cave near Gaps, to illustrate how Arthur kind of notes that their work on the caves firstly came about by having time away from the railways. And this was produced in a period where he was stationed in that area. And now I would just like to show you some more of the material from the collection. And as I was putting this together, I quickly realized that I had far too much to put in it. So I do hope that this does give some kind of nice representation of the types of material that are in it. And I would also like to very quickly apologize for the quality of some of these images, and not to blame everything on the pandemic, but access has been limited and these were taken very quickly one afternoon. So here we have some rubbings of a coin that was found in front of cave number 7 in the Kanheri Caves in 1852. And here we have copies of the paintings on the ceiling of cave number 14 in Kanheri, also by Arthur. And again by Arthur, there's friezes from caves number 3 and number 51. And these are also like they're all within the same folder, and there's the time range within this one folder spans about 15 years. So it just shows that they're constantly going back and constantly like working on it. Here again, notes from the Kanheri Caves from around 1870, and the inserted smaller leaves are questions that Arthur has left for Edward for him to go and find answers to and check on. Here we have just a drawing of the cave near Kandar in Salsette, and the Montpensier Caves again in Salsette. These were both done in 1854, and this was when Henry was stationed in that region. Here we have pilaster ornaments and the ornamentation on the parapet of veranda of cave number 26 in Nasik. And again, there's no dates on these ones, but Arthur was stationed there between 1861 and 62. Here we have a plan of the Kondati Caves in Salsette, which were produced by Edward. And then there are drawings of the sculpture on the northern wall of cave number 13 in the Kondati Caves by Arthur. Here we have inscriptions and descriptions of the Kala Caves, and these are like 36 pages or so of handwritten descriptions of Edward like walking through the cave series. And again, the inscriptions that he copied. And these were all copied out again by hand later on by Arthur Anderson West when he was compiling this material. Here there's a floor plan of the Puna Cave. And again, these are photographs of the same cave which were taken some 8 years earlier, both by Arthur Anderson West. Here we have a sketch from Edward's notebook from a Parsi Dakma just north of Aurangabad. And here we have a plan of the Baja Caves by Henry and Arthur. And here I just wanted to show from the Baja Caves. So this is, I think just from the Chatia Cave, these are rubbings of the tops of columns. And just to kind of like show the different types of material that's in the collection. And then just lastly, so these are some sculptural and architectural detail from cave number 19 at Ajanta from 1866. And there are 15 or so works like this, and they're all they've all got a really nice descriptive piece of material that go with them as well. And then just some final notes, and just to kind of round it off about why I found this collection really interesting. And I think it's because it moves away from Edward William West. And I think that as a member of the American Oriental Society and of the Royal Asiatic Society, and a recipient of the Society's Triennial Gold Medal, Edward's position within scholarship is widely recognised. The vast majority of the papers and articles published in relation to the Kanheri Caves, as well as other sites, were published under Edward's name. However, what is clear from this collection is that at least the bulk of the work was actually executed by his brothers, and it was Arthur who was the driving force behind this collection. And I think this collection offers an opportunity to delve into the West family, learn more about the interests and works of Arthur, Clement and Henry and Walter. And I think also as well to archaeological surveys more broadly before the formation of the Archaeological Survey of India and the field of architectural history within the British Empire. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to Ed, to Emma and to Nancy and the Society for giving me the opportunity to be doing this over the past year or so. So thank you. How do I stop sharing?
Thank you, Lily, for that wonderful presentation, a wonderful a tour through this incredibly rich, incredibly meticulous collection documenting some really wondrous art. So thank you. I mean, it's clear that there's a lot more to be discovered and to be said about this collection. I have one or two questions myself, and then hopefully we'll get some more from the audience.
Am I still sharing my screen? Sorry, shall I?
Yeah, I can still see. Yeah, you're still sharing it. Yeah.
I'm going to try and stop it.
Hi, Lily. It should be towards the top of your screen. I think next to a green bar.
trust me to not get the tech. Stop. Aha. Got it. Thank you.
Lovely.
Well, let's be honest, we're all here, we're humanities people here. None of us are.
No, I'm absolutely terrible at it, but.
So my question is, just from my vague familiarity with the famous Edward West's work on Zoroastrianism, we know that one way or another, it's fairly well documented the links that he had with what are often referred to as local informants. So Parsis who were providing him with information and manuscripts about Zoroastrianism and sort of collaborating with him in his research. To what extent do the archives in the Kanheri and other caves reflect the West's engagement with local people and their benefiting from local knowledge?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what's mentioned in there, the majority of it is to do with kind of where they're stationed and their employment. But there are moments where they don't mention people by name, but they talk about like local guides. So when they're stopping over somewhere and they go and speak to people and they ask to be shown local sites. And there's also a period of 4.5 months, I think, where Henry actually lives in one of the caves. I mean, he's living with someone there. This is in the Kanheri Caves. So there isn't a whole lot, and I think that would be really interesting to find out, but there are little glimpses of it in places. Yeah, and I don't know if parts have been written out because it's kind of clear that the material's been gone over quite a few times by Arthur before sending it off, and he's annotating a lot of it as he goes, and he dates all of his annotations and copies out previous work. So maybe there's other stuff, but yeah.
Thank you. Also, I'm just curious to know how much of this material ever saw the light of day in the sense of being published. You mentioned that some of it was published by Edward.
Yeah, very, very, very few of it. The majority of what's published is to do with more with inscriptions and like rubbings. There's a couple of maps are published in the Royal Asiatic Society's journal, but beyond that, not a whole lot.
And do you know how this fits into the wider story of the British or European understanding of the Kanheri Caves?
And that's something that I've tried to like think about throughout, and I think it's something I'm still kind of like forming, I guess, like an opinion on, and I'm still like reading kind of as I go. But from what I can tell, there was very little written about it before, and there hasn't been a whole lot published on it since. Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering that question particularly well, but
no. Well, I mean, it's clearly the case that there's a lot more to be said about it. So hopefully, either you or somebody else will decide to take this on. It's an extraordinarily rich collection. We have a question from David Nicol. Does the West collection include material on now lost structures of paintings and so on?
So there's been a few instances where I've tried to find caves that are mentioned or temples that are mentioned that I can't find any reference. I don't know, is this because they're called by different names now, because there are quite a few that I've been able to find, but the names have changed slightly as time's gone on. But I don't know if they're just no longer there. And in regards to the artwork, I don't know, and that isn't something that I have explored yet.
Well, thank you, Lily. If we get any more questions during or after Emma's talk, then we might call upon you again to enter the fray. But thank you once more for incredible presentation, and thank you also for your work with the West papers. So
thank you. Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for listening.
So we will now introduce the last speaker for this evening's event, which is Emma Jones, who joined the Society as its new archivist in October last year after completing her master's degree in Archives and Records Management at UCL. This evening, Emma is going to talk to us about her first cataloguing projects at the Society. So over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Ed. I'll just get around to sharing my screen. Hope it'll work okay. There we go. Can everyone see that okay?
Not yet.
Oh. Is it on now?
There it is, yeah.
Yeah, it's all good. So yeah, hi everyone. So for those who don't know who I am, I'm the new archivist at the Society and I started in October. So in terms of my background prior to working at the Society, I was previously an archives trainee at Wellcome Collection for 3 years, and I've recently completed my master's in Archives and Records Management at UCL. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about 2 collections that I've catalogued during the first few months that I've been working at the Society. So the first is the personal papers of the Israeli historian Abraham Poliak, whilst the second is a collection of papers from the Oriental Translation Fund. So this funded the translation and publication of manuscripts containing some of the greatest works of Asian history, science and literature. Oh, I'll come back one. There we go. So yes, the cataloguing of both of these collections was slightly impacted by COVID-19 and lockdown restrictions. So obviously, for instance, parts of this staff are working remotely. So I'm going to talk to you about the impact this had on both projects and how I adapted to this. I also chose to talk about these collections as well, as they both relate to funds that were created by the Society to help support viable publications related to Asian cultures and for them to be made accessible to wider audiences. So I'm just going to start by discussing the collections of papers that we hold on the former Israeli historian Abraham Poliak and give a brief biography for those who are unfamiliar with who he is. So there's little information on Professor Poliak's early years, but we know that he emigrated with his family in 1923 to Mandatory Palestine, where they settled in the city of Haifa. So in 1930, he moved to Jerusalem, and in 1934, he received his master's qualification around the culture of Islam. Professor Poliak decided to continue his studies and was awarded his PhD in 1936. So his thesis was around the subject of the history of land relationships in Egypt, Syria, and Israel during the late Middle Ages. So during this period, he began to write a number of articles about his research, so notably around the Khazars, for instance, and this appeared in many foreign publications. So in 1937, he became a member of the Royal Asiatic Society, and in 1939, he received the Prose Publication Medal by the Society for his research on feudalism in the Middle East. So this work was published as Feudalism in Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and the Lebanon, and it was published under the Society's Prose Publication Fund. So in terms of the Prose Publication Fund, this was established in 1909, and it was for the publication of original works, more specifically connected with the history or geography of India. So this was founded with money, which had been subscribed in the Presidency of Madras in connection with the commemoration of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. So this medal was given out quite rarely, as it was felt that the value of the medal would be depreciated if it was given out more frequently. So in the end, under the Prose Publication Fund, 21 volumes were published. So as many of you are aware, the Society does still promote young scholars and their work today. So an example of this is the Bailey Prize, for instance, and this offers an award for a distinguished thesis in an Asian subject, which falls in scope with the Society's aims. So in later years, Professor Poliak became a Professor of History of the Middle Ages at Tel Aviv University, and he also founded and directed the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. So he passed away on the 5th of March 1970 at the age of 59. So this here is just an image taken from Poliak's publication, Feudalism in Egypt, which can be found in the Society's library collections. So I recently finished the cataloguing of these papers. So most of these took place during the recent lockdown. So to complete this catalogue, I needed to adapt to my working practices. So for instance, examples included consulting images of the collection that I'd taken when I was in the building, using the original box list, which thanks to the previous archivist was very detailed, and also taking a small amount of material home with me. So the date range of the material is from 1968 to 1971, and it includes one archival folder filled with correspondence and 3 notebooks. So the material's in fairly good condition and no preservation or repair work needed to be carried out. So in terms of the provenance of the material, as the correspondence was primarily between the previous secretary of the society, who was Diana Crawford, and Professor Poliak, it was likely that this was just kept in a filing system by the society. So I'll move on to the notebook shortly, but these were sent to the society by Professor Poliak, and they were kept upon his death in 1970. So these papers have now all been catalogued and they're on our archives cataloguing system, Archives Hub. So as I just mentioned, the correspondence in the collection is mainly between Professor Poliak and the Secretary of the Society, Diana Crawford. So when cataloguing these, I decided to catalogue them by date order instead of by recipient, as I felt it would be easier for researchers to navigate and understand the context behind each of the letters. So the correspondence began with a request sent from the Library du Liban in Beirut, and they requested for the reprint of 1,000 copies of Poliak's publication, Feudalism in Egypt. However, the society had already made the decision to reprint the publication, and they sent a letter to Professor Poliak asking if he would like to make any amendments or alterations to the reprint. When looking up about this collection, it was unclear why there was such a substantial demand for the work during this period in time, and it would be interesting to find out why this was the case. So when I looked at reviews of the publication when it was first published, a review from the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies commented that the monograph is of great interest and is full of interesting suggestions and notes. However, there were slight criticisms with some of the terminology used. So Professor Poliak, he was enthusiastic about the request for a reprint, and he made amendments to the original publication, which included a revised introduction. Unfortunately, though, the reprint never came to fruition due to a lack of funding, and Poliak passed away in 1970. So this is an image here sent from the Library du Liban that we're requesting the 1,000 copies of the publication. So as you can see in red here, there's a reference to the Prose Publication Fund, and it highlights here that this was volume 17 out of the series of the Prose Publication Fund publications. So this is quite an informal airmail which was sent by Professor Poliak. And it basically showcases that he was happy for the planned reprint to occur and that he'd make some additions to the original text. So this particular letter is quite significant for many reasons. So the Secretary of the Society is writing to Professor Poliak to basically inform him that there's not enough monetary resources in the fund to pay for a complete reprint of the publication. But the society seemed unaware at this point that Professor Poliak had already passed away. So as you can see by this letter, it's addressed on the 6th of August 1971. But Professor Poliak had already died a year previous to this. So I'm just going to move on to discussing the notebooks. So there was 3 of these in total, and these contain handwritten amendments that Professor Poliak made to his publication, Feudalism in Egypt. So by looking through them, it appeared that Poliak handwrote his revision of the original publication and he made amendments in pencil. However, because there was a lot of alterations that the professor had made, it meant that a complete reprint was needed of the publication. So when Professor Poliak had passed away, the notebooks were offered back to the literary executors by the Society of Professor Poliak, but it was unclear what happened following this. So whether the executors responded and offered them to the Society to keep, or whether they actually responded back to the letter in the first place. So yeah, so here's an example taken from one of the notebooks. So as you can see by this, there's a lot of alterations made, particularly, you can see in pencil above each of some of the words. And this was the correspondence which was sent by the Society to the literary executors upon hearing of Professor Poliak's death. So I'm just going to highlight the potential research interest of this collection and my experiences when cataloguing these papers. So when cataloguing the collection, I felt a sadness for Professor Poliak, as he never got a chance to see this work republished. But it did reinforce to me the importance of my role in making these notebooks accessible for scholarly research. It also highlighted as well the value of Professor Poliak's work, in that other institutions across the world were requesting high reprints of this publication 30 years after it had originally been written. So in terms of the Prose Publication Fund itself, I find little reference to this within the collections, and particularly its links to the publication Feudalism in Egypt. So, for instance, why was this publication chosen? I did, however, find some Prose Publication Fund ledgers within the institutional archive, which were uncatalogued. And I did find reference to the publication in one of these ledgers. But overall, it's evident that more research is needed around this particular fund. Working from home, though, as well, did have some advantages, because it allowed me to conduct more in-depth research around Professor Poliak and his work. And some of these findings were recently published in a blog post on the Society's website. So this was taken from one of the ledgers that I just talked about. So here you can see reference to Poliak in red, and it's not very clear, but it was. It says here it was number 17. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to discussing the Oriental Translation Fund papers now. So this collection, it holds a special place for me, as it was the first collection of papers that I catalogued as archivist at the Society. So as I started cataloguing these in October, lockdown had a little impact upon these, because I think there was a circuit breaker lockdown in November, but by then most of it had been catalogued. But it did present the opportunity to write more enhanced cataloguing descriptions within Archives Hub and to help make the collection as accessible as possible. So I'm just going to provide an overview of the fund, for those who are unfamiliar with what it is. So it was established in 1828 under the membership of Sir Gore Ouseley. So Sir Gore Ouseley, he served as ambassador to Persia, and he was involved in negotiating treaties, principally between Russia and Persia. He was also a keen linguist, so he taught himself Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian, and he was also a former fellow of the Society. So when it was first set up, the fund, King George VI was patron, and it also had a number of notable subscribers. So this included Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and as you all might know, the founder of the Society, Henry Colebrook. So the copyright of the fund was initially held by the Oriental Translation Committee. So these control the fund and were theoretically independent from the Society. So in this first period, a number of notable works were published, and these formed Series 1 of the fund. Publication lists in the collection showed that there was about 71 translations within this first series. However, initial enthusiasm did begin to decline by the 1860s, and operations were suspended due to a shortage of funds. However, by the 1880s, there were continuous talks to revive the fund, and most of these efforts were led by the British Orientalist and translator Forster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot. So Arbuthnot, he had an interest in the translation of texts for Western audiences, and he took control of the management of the fund as director. So he would give generous financial support to the fund, also alongside Lord Northbrook and E.T. Sturdy. So these new publications, these would form Series 2 of the fund. And as I've just mentioned, Arbuthnot would fund many of these publications himself. Also significantly, the fund does still exist today, and has led to the publishing of translations in recent years. So the most recent one was AppBT, and this is accessible on the Society's website for those of you who might be interested in having a look. So in terms of the cataloguing of these collections, the papers and ledgers relating to the activities of the fund, these were located across uncatalogued material within the Society's institutional archive. So this covered the period of 1836 to 2010, and it consisted of minute books, correspondence, publication lists, and purchases and stock books. So in terms of the condition of the material, it was in fairly good condition. One of the ledgers, the binding did start to become loose, so I just tied this together with archival tape. And the fund publications from Series 1 and 2 have been catalogued, and they are accessible to researchers. So I'm just going to go over some of the committee minutes from the collection. So yeah, the collection contains 4 minute books from the Oriental Fund Committee, and it covers the period 1828 to 1865. So this covers important information in regards to the running of the fund, so such as financial information, purchases made, activities. It also covered the purpose of the fund, so I'm just going to repeat what I've mentioned here. So it's interesting and valuable works on Eastern history, science, and belles-lettres, as are still in MS. The object proposed is to publish, free of expense to the authors, translations of the whole or parts of such works, generally to be accompanied by the original texts printed separately. So most of the minutes were signed off by the chairman of the fund, who was Sir Gore Ouseley. Also as well, the 4th minute book was also quite significant as well, because it covered the period when the fund was suspended in 1860. So the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society, they entered negotiations to purchase the stock in this period. So this is an example of one of the minute books taken from the collection. So as I've highlighted at the bottom, they were signed by Sir Gore Ouseley. And this one was from April 1828. So this image is taken from the final minute book. So it was in November 1865. So it stated that no more subscriptions should be called in, and that the Wesleyan Missionary Society were to enter also upon negotiations for the purchase of the stock and copyright of the OT Society's publications. When looking at both of these, I found the writing style quite interesting. So if I go back to the one previous, the writing style is quite elaborate, quite detailed. If you go to the last entry, it's a lot briefer, slightly more informal. So in terms of the correspondence within the collection, this includes letters from Forster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot about his work in revising the fund in 1888. You've got correspondence ledgers, which summarise the general activities of the fund, and also a letter from the German Orientalist Friedrich Max Müller, and he also did help to offer to help resuscitate the fund in 1861. So yeah, this image here, it's taken of a leaflet which showcases the confirmed revival of the fund. So this followed a meeting at the Royal Asiatic Society's rooms on the 4th of December 1889. So here they appointed a new committee for the fund, which included Arbuthnot, and a number of resolutions were passed. So yeah, this included the establishment of a reserve fund of £5,000, and that a number of works should be produced in a range of languages. So this image here, it's part of a larger document which was written by Forster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, and it's basically a list of proposed works that he wanted to form Series 2 of the fund. So I've highlighted the little, the name at the top, and it says E. Rohatzek. So yeah, that stands for Edward Rohatzek, and he was a translator of several works of Islamic literature. So the reason why I've highlighted him with this particular document is because the Society is currently in the process of looking to publish another one of Rohatzek's translations. So I've highlighted this letter here in showcasing Arbuthnot's quite close relationship with the Society, because in this letter he was expressing his intention to donate his own private collection of manuscripts and stock of the fund to the Society upon his death. Also, Arbuthnot as well wanted to transfer the copyright of the translation of the Oriental Translation Fund to the Society, alongside £500 to pay for the next 3 volumes. So I'm just going to summarise the significance of this collection. So these papers are important in highlighting the beginnings of a fund which has made accessible great works of Asian literature to Western audiences. It's also remarkable as well that the fund had such longevity and is still in operation today. So this is a tribute to the ongoing enthusiasm for rendering the great works of Asian literature into English. Also, Forster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot played a pivotal role in this, and it was his commitment for making these works accessible that also contributed to its longevity. So very little has been previously published about this fund, and as we approach the Society's 200th anniversary in 2023, I feel it's been a good time to make this collection publicly accessible to wider audiences. So in coming to the end of this presentation, overall I've learnt a great deal from cataloguing both of these collections, and particularly during COVID as well, and having to adapt to new ways of working. But I do feel that lots of positives can be taken from this. So it's provided the chance to conduct further research around these collections, so for instance through writing blog posts, and it's also provided the chance to write more meaningful cataloguing descriptions. Both the Oriental Translation Fund and Prose Publication Fund do require further exploration, particularly as there are uncatalogued items within the collection which refer to these and relate to them. So both collections are publicly accessible now in Archives Hub. So once we reopen in April. So so that brings my presentation to conclusion. So thank you for listening, and does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Okay. Okay, I think that worked okay.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a really interesting juxtaposition of two quite different but complementary collections, one of personal papers and one of institutional papers, although of course both, while not actually about the RAS per se, both shining a light on the workings of the Society over the past 2 centuries, and showing the enduring nature of the Society's mission, in the sense of promoting scholarship in Asian studies, promoting an awareness and enthusiasm for the great works of Asian literature, but also the enduring nature of a shortage of funds which recurs across both the attempts to publish Poliak's work and also the recurring theme across the OTF as well. So, of course, there was one of the OTF published a lot of books in the 19th century, between the 1820s and the 1840s, and the recurring kind of theme of not having the money to publish these books. It creates a sense of a small commercial or popular market, but it's easy to forget that there were works of Asian literature which did achieve a resonance with a mass popular audience in Victorian Britain. Of course, the Arabian Nights has been a favourite in Britain for centuries among readers of all ages, and Sir Richard Burton, of course, was a famous popularizer of the Arabian Nights, and Edward Fitzgerald published an enormously commercially successful translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, published by Bernard Quaritch in the late 1850s. So the Society unfortunately just missed out on some of the real money makers, but that's not to detract from the fact that the cultural and intellectual value of the works of the Society, or rather I should say the OTF, published in partnership or under the umbrella of the Society's nourishing influence. And I do hope that there will be a lot more work done on the Oriental Translation Fund in the coming years, because it really is a very, very interesting and important institution, and one with a very rich history. So I'll stop. And I just wanted to see, we've got some comments coming in, but we haven't got any questions. So if anyone does have any questions for Emma or either our other presenters who are still with us, then please do send those in while you have the chance. Otherwise, we've got another question from Alison. Have you had time to cross-reference the Oriental Translation Fund material with the RAS Council minutes, which I suppose, well, I'll let you answer.
No, I haven't. So that's probably something that I could sort of potentially look into, definitely. Because obviously, there is minute books relating to the fund. But it would definitely be interested to look through the council minutes and see if there is kind of any references, for sure.
It's something which requires a lot more groundwork, I think, to understand. But whether there are complementary, contrasting, or competing priorities and agendas going into the publication strategy of the OTF vis-a-vis the publication strategy of the Society as represented through the journal, would be another thing that would be quite interesting to know. On the other hand, of course, the audience of the translations for the OTF was probably considered to be more mass market, if not more, than the audience for the journal itself. Ian's snuck in a question for Lily. If we can get Lily, did the Wests conduct any analysis of the Ajanta, Ellora, etc. caves, or simply record them?
No, it was more of just recording them and kind of, saying what they saw. There's no kind of analysis. And really, like, comparatively, the amount that's on Ajanta and Ellora is really, really small in comparison to the rest of the material.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to call a halt to it there. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. And we look forward to welcoming you back to the Society in person soon. And before we go, I'd just like to extend our thanks again to each of tonight's presenters. So thank you. Okay, well, see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.